The deep crankbait is truly one of the best lures that we have to catch giant bass year-round. Over the years, there have been numerous high-level tournaments won with this bait, but whether you fish tournaments or not, understanding all the nuances of a deep crank can help you to catch more and bigger fish. So in this video, we talked to Garrett Paquette, a former Elite Series pro and deep crank specialist, about what makes a great deep diving crankbait, the gear you need to throw one, and how to fish this bait a little differently to trigger some of the biggest bass that swim in your lake. So stay tuned, it's gonna be a good one. Not only have you had success in the open, level tournaments, but even like you almost won at Lake Fork, an Elite Series tournament against the best guys in the world, a tournament with a deep crank in your hand. So the big thing that I wanted to ask, this is one of my first questions, is what makes a good deep crank, like the lure itself? And you can even name the brands that you really like, but what makes a good deep crank?
Yeah, definitely. For one, like you kind of said, the deep crank, it was, there was a time probably end of, or maybe like 2005-ish to 2015-ish, where if you were out there in the post spawn, that's what the tournament was going to be. It was going to be one on a deep crank. Everyone's going to be throwing it. It's the best way to trigger the schools of fish, trigger the big bites. And now, now it seems like with the fishing pressure, maybe some of the technology that's changed. But I still think that bite is still out there. It's just, maybe guys aren't seeking it out like they were. Mm-hmm. But the bait for me, or what makes a good bait for me is, and if you go online, there's thousands of deep crankbaits, right? Mm-hmm. So for one, you have to select the right bait. And there's a couple ways to do that. One, now, and I think we're going to keep this, mostly largemouth related. We're going to be talking like, ledge fishing, clean bottom, stuff like that. So your bait has to contact the bottom. Mm-hmm. And, in an ideal situation, you're going to select a bait that dives, a foot or two deeper than you're fishing. So if you're in, 14 foot of water, I want a crankbait that's going to go 15. I want to go 16. If I'm in 20 foot, I want to go 21, 22 foot, something like that. But there are a couple ways to get by that if you don't want to go out and buy a bait that, if you don't want to have a 10-foot crankbait and a 12-foot one and a 15 and a 20. So there's a few baits out there that I feel like, or I should back up real quick. So why that's key that your crankbait is only going to dive a foot or two deeper than the bottom is because when it hits the bottom, you want that bait to maintain the action that it has. You don't want a bait that dives so far past the bottom that it kind of slides around when it's on the bottom. And, that seems weird to understand, but for those of you guys that have done it, that have thrown a crankbait that, let's say, is designed to dive 20, if you throw that in 10 foot, you can tell when it's hitting the bottom, it's almost just sliding around. It has no action because it's just, you're not down to that peak performance of what it should be. Mm-hmm. But there are a few that you can get by with that. And I'll talk, this isn't a sponsored product. This is one that if you've seen the Fork tournament, you kind of saw me throwing. This is the Strike King 8XD. Now this bait is, you can get it down to about 20 foot. But this bait here, if you throw it in 10 foot, it's going to have the same action hitting the bottom than it would if you were throwing it in 18 foot. It's almost like a square bill in a way that you can get by with not throwing it in the exact depth that it was made for. So that's one that I always consider. I always have it tied on. Maybe I get in trouble for saying that, but it is what it is. Another one with the same characteristics. This is a Spro Fat Papa 70. Mm-hmm. Now this one's this is like more of a 14 to 15 foot crankbait. But if I throw this thing out there in 5 foot and it hits the bottom, it's literally going to have the same action that it would if it were in 15 foot of water. So that's something I really look for. That way I can almost kind of cheat the system. Otherwise, there's a lot of crankbaits out there. You got to be real particular where you can throw them. You can easily ruin the action of your crankbait just by throwing it the wrong depth of the water. So I try to throw those baits they always maintain the action that they're supposed to have, no matter the depth of the water.
That's actually really, that's interesting because I noticed on a certain bait that I was throwing that it felt weird when it hit the bottom and I could almost see my line going off to the side. I thought it was tuned bad. And I realized like when I casted the bait out, I could reel it in. It would go straight in the water, but like when it hit the bottom, it would just always slide. Like he said, slide across the bottom, which is not, I'm sure you may catch a fish on it from time to time, but you really want that action and that deflection. I think another thing is like when it hits something and it deflects off, if it's too aggressively like so deep, it like doesn't have that right deflection that it needs to.
Yep.
So that's really that's a really good point, and one that it's just a nuance that a lot of guys don't always think about.
Yeah, because when you're fishing out there, I mean, like you said, the deflection is key. I mean, your bait's always hitting the bottom. This isn't a technique in this situation where you're not bringing it through the water column, and you want to be down there digging up the bottom. If there's stumps or rocks, you want to be hitting that. But when you hit those, like you said, you don't want it just to slide off and your cast be done. I mean, you want it to hit it, kind of jolt off and get back on track. That's how you're going to trigger those big bites and get those fish going. So how the bait hits the bottom is super critical. And, that's not, and I'm not knocking other crankbaits out there. Like, this is one that I'm really falling in love with this year. This is a Spro Outsider. New bait came out. Cool design. There's no rattles in it. All the weight is on the outside of the bait. This one, this is like a 20-footer. If I throw this in 10, it will slide around a lot. So it's not, it doesn't track true in water way shallower than it is. But if I hit the bottom in 20 foot or 19 foot like it's designed for, it has great deflection. So it's not saying that your bait has to run perfect in 5 feet water less than it's designed for, but just make sure your bait is running perfect. Make sure you're matching the situation, using the bait that when it hits the cover, when it hits the bottom, it's acting the way it should be in the water.
Yeah. What's the reasoning behind having the weight on the outside of the bait on that Spro Outsider?
Yeah, that's just that's kind of a new concept. Like there's no internal ball bearing to throw. It's gives it a little bit of a different action, a wider action than most baits are used for, and it actually surprisingly casts well. Like when I first heard about this idea, the first thing I thought was like, man, I don't know if that's going to cast right, because usually you want some weight to transfer to the back and make those long casts. But this thing, however they got it or however they designed it, I mean, it casts exceptionally well. So they knew something I didn't. It's a totally different look. Still casts really far. Different sound, stuff like that. I think it's more of a, just a different look to the fish. I mean, as you guys know, it's nowadays with the pressure and everyone out there, everyone has access to the information. You got to kind of stay on top of it and keep showing the fish new looks. And that's kind of what Spro did with that Outsider series.
This video is brought to you by the Deep Dive app. This is an app that you can download on your phone that helps you to find bass on your local bodies of water a lot quicker. Once you download this app, you can actually select the lake that you are fishing, and then you can input data like water temperature, water clarity, whether you are fishing around vegetation, or if you are fishing in a windy or protected area. Once you input all this information, the app will actually spit out lures, techniques, and areas that you can go on your local body of water to catch bass. This app is backed by hundreds of different tournament results from across the nation and can be extremely accurate. So if you guys would like to help support the Bass Fishing HQ channel and allow me to bring more videos like this to you, hit that link down below and download the Deep Dive app today. One thing that you said there too, specifically about that crankbait, but I know that there's several other crankbaits like this, but it doesn't have rattles. It would be, I guess you consider it a silent bait. And I think that that's actually a really big part of deep cranking, actually all crankbaits in general. But I just love your input. Like, have you seen days where it's like they'll only hit that silent one versus one that has rattles?
Yeah, I mean, it might not be as black and white as that. Because, I mean, if you take this, there's no rattles in there. This is still pretty loud, right? You can, I mean, there's going to be noise. Your hooks are going to be clanging, the split ring, stuff like that. So you're never really going to get a true silent bait. But for me, it's almost, I almost make it a 1-2 punch. I still really love cranking with the big rattles to start off. I like that loud noise. I think that's going to catch your biggest, most aggressive fish. But if I'm on a spot or I'm in an area where I've gone through it and it seems like the bites quit, I've certainly noticed where if I go back to a silent bait or quote unquote silent bait, that I'm able to trigger them up or trigger them again, get a couple more bites or get an extra bite before I leave, things like that. So I almost use it, I don't know if initially it makes a big difference whether you start with silent or rattles, but I think making that switch after the fish have seen what you're using can make a huge difference. That's where I really try to incorporate the silent baits. And you can do that with colors too. Like if you start with a natural color, you come back with a white or vice versa, start with something real bright and they get conditioned, and you can go back with something a little more translucent. But I think showing those fish a switch is very key to just extending your bite window per spot.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've seen that firsthand a lot, which is it's always fun when you feel like you kind of fooled the fish into catching a couple more, which can make a big difference, especially if you're a tournament fisherman. One thing that I'm very interested to know too is just your rod reel line setup. Are you do you like the glass or at least composite style rods? Do you not? What's your setup for a deep crank?
Yeah, so I have two setups, for these big baits, these 20-footers. I'll just say I'm not a glass guy. I'm not really even a composite guy, just because if my bait does get in the cover, it gets in, like, let's say there's grass down there, I feel like that glass is too slow to clear my bait. And also I feel like I don't drive the hooks home like I should. And, guys are going to argue that, of course, but that's what's worked for me. I like all graphite, more of a moderate action. So I guess, maybe you can find that in a composite rod. But for these 20-footers, 25-footers, I like a 7-11 heavy cranking rod. Not a flipping stick, but it's still a big heavy rod, but it's got a nice deep bend to it. I like that long rod. I like that 7-11. With this deal, you want to try to cast as far as you can. So the more rod length, the more you're going to cast. And then when I get into something with, like this 15-footer, like that Fat Papa, I downsize a little bit. I feel like with the 7-11, it's almost too much rod where I don't throw the bait as far. I know that kind of just contradicted what I said, but if you go down to a 7.6, you'll cast a lot further with that bait. That rod will just load more. And I'm throwing just a typical 7.6 medium heavy graphite rod. Not even made for cranking, just something, not something super stiff. You want to have some bend, but I'm all for having some power too. I mean, you're going to catch some big fish. You're going to get bit 35 yards out from the boat. So you're going to want a little bit of power in that back half of that rod to make sure those hooks are drove home and you can control those fish. And then, maybe not more important, but as important is the reel you use. And I'm not with a reel company, but I throw like the Lew's BB1. I've thrown the Corrado in the past, Revo winch. But the key with these is the spool size. So if you compare this to, I think this is like a Hyper Mag here. It's not I don't know if you can see, but like this spool here is a lot more narrow where this is wide. And what that does is when I make a long cast, more of my line stays on this. So if I make a long cast with this little low profile reel, it feels like half the line's gone. And instead of turning, 30 inches or 35 inches per turn, you're down to like 15 to 17. Whereas with these bigger spools, these deeper spools with more line, instead of turning 35, you maybe are turning like 31, 32 inches. So you have more of the line return per hand or per reel turn with these wider spools. So that's always something to consider. Like I said, it's not brand orientated. It's more of the reel style orientated, but I do not like those real low profile reels for deep cranking, really for offshore fishing in general when you're making long casts. So I'm not a guy that's using like an 8-to-1 gear ratio. I use a 6.3, 6.4. And I'll turn the handle myself. So if I got to bring it real fast, I'll sit there and reel. But I've noticed, I feel like the sensitivity that comes through and I know it sounds weird, but you do feel some vibration and stuff with these reels. And I feel like the sensitivity I get back with a 6 gear ratio or even a 5 is a lot better than with an 8. The 8 almost turns it so fast in the reel that you almost don't even feel your bait. And I don't want that. I want to know what's going on. I want to know if I'm hitting bottom, if the bait feels right, stuff like that. So, but make sure if you're going to do that and get serious, have a little bit of a wider spool than those low profiles. That's a big deal, I think.
That's interesting. Super interesting. Are you like locking down the drag on it? Do you use the drag, or if the fish goes to run, you just click the thumb bar? Or
yeah, I mean, I have it tight. I definitely don't want any drag slip on the hook set, so it's mostly tight. And the reality is, bait casting drags aren't great in general. So I'll either back my drag off right away, but generally, like especially around the boat, I'm thumbing the spool. So I'll thumb it and I'll kind of let some line out or let the fish pull it out, stuff like that. And that's just bait casting in general. I don't, it's not like a spinning reel where I feel comfortable that I can let the fish kind of run around for a minute. I'd rather control it with my thumb. So I guess on the, they're on the side of being tighter.
Yeah. One thing I just kind of wanted to reiterate what you said is basically that for those who may have not understood is that by having that wider spool, he's saying that when you make a long bomb cast, that line is not going to go as deep into the spool. What you cast off is not going to go as deep into the spool. So therefore, when you start cranking, you're more true to what your actual gear ratio is. If he's with a 6.3 to 1 that's picking up 30 some inches of line, and he has a shallow spool and he casts that off, like he said, it's almost like you're all the way down to the bottom. So if you're all the way down to the bottom, you're now bringing in maybe 15 or 16 inches versus that 13 inches for each reel turn. Mm-hmm. And that can make a big difference, especially when it comes to cranking, because a lot of times, what we've seen with cranking, at least what I've seen, is speed can be really, really key, whether that's maybe a slow speed, but a lot of times burning that thing it really is kind of as quick as you can be really the deal to getting some bites. Have you seen the same thing with kind of speed with those deep cranks?
Yeah, that bait, it's a total reaction bite. I don't want them to think about it. I want that crankbait to whiz by their face as fast as I can physically make it come through the water without, ruining the integrity of the action of the bait. So speed is everything. That goes back to your gear ratio. I want as much line on there. I want it to be, as close to 100% of what the gear ratio is supposed to be. I mean, it's a fast retrieve. I might stop the bait every now and then or twitch it or stuff like that. But 97% of my days out there, it's working the bait as fast as I can. And, I've seen it many times where I'm fishing next to guys and I can tell I'm catching them better than them just because I'm simply turning the handle faster than they are. And I'm able to do it for, longer periods of time because it is hard on the body. I mean, it's something that you go do it for an hour, you're going to feel it. But, if you're able to do it for 8 hours, that's a huge advantage versus the next guy.
Yeah. And I think that's important. Running the speed is having the correct reel for if you're deep cranking and you're really, cranking it, you would think, it would be better to have a faster reel. The higher gear ratio you go, you lose power. Mm-hmm. And so by sticking with the 6.3, 6.4 to 1, you can crank it as fast as you can, but you're maintaining that power, that torque. And just like you said, Garrett, an hour of deep cranking with a 6.3 reel is so much easier than trying to do it with an 8.1. Yeah. It just is. So having the proper reel, do you think is equally as important to have the proper reel as it is the rod? And we haven't touched on the line yet. Mm. So what do you think? Reel, rod, and then let's hit on line.
Yeah, I think reel and rod to me, I'd probably put a little more emphasis on the rod just because with a crankbait and the treble hooks, if you go way too stiff, you're probably going to lose a bunch of fish because you'll just pull the hooks out of their mouth, or way too soft, you may never get the hook into the fish. But the reel is really close. It's probably like 60% rod, 40% reel. And like I said, I'm not against the high gear ratio. Like if you guys can go out there and throw the 8s and stuff, then that's fine. But I feel like, with the 6, I'm still able to turn the handle fast enough to where, I'm at like the maximum capacity for what that bait can handle as far as speed. So, but if you feel like you can't get the handle fast enough, maybe bumping it up is, a better option. But to me, the 6, I can get the bait as fast as I need to. So that's why I choose that. And then going with the line. So I throw pretty much 14-pound Sunline Sniper exclusively for this. I might bump it up a little bit. Like if we're in Texas, maybe go to like 16 or something if we're going to be dealing with real giant fish. But I'm not an 8-pound guy. I'm not a 10-pound guy. I know some guys are like, you can get the bait deeper with that. I'm not a 12-pound guy. I think there's a big correlation between line stretch and the action of the bait. Like if you've ever thrown a crankbait on braid, I mean, that thing just buzzes down there. You know, the bait comes in so nice. I mean, you have all your action. And I feel like that difference between 12-pound line versus 14-pound line with the deep cranks is kind of that line size difference where you really get a big return on action in the 14. So if I go throw out 12-pound and I burn it in, I feel like the line almost absorbs so much shock, or it stretches out so much that the bait doesn't have the same action. Whereas if I throw a 14-pound line out there, the line's not going to stretch as much, and I feel like you get a lot better action on the bait. So that's kind of like I'm trying to think. That's kind of like the
tipping
as
point.
As low as I'll go.
Yeah.
So,
the thing
the
that
tipping point, yeah, that's a better way to.
Yeah, the thing that I love about Garrett, and when we room together at Fishing the Opens, is how, and you see this with the guys that we interview that are really good at a technique, is how much further they understand a few different things. For example, like a line we just talked about, 12 versus 14. A lot of guys are thinking simply a running depth difference, but he's talking here about a difference in the line stretching and how that is affecting the bait, which a lot of guys are simply not going to think about. So, and I've seen that with you, Garrett, with a lot of different techniques, just how intricate, how detail oriented you are with a lot of those things. So that's a really cool little juice nugget there for you.
Dropping it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just so detailed and in tune with the technique that you're doing.
Yeah. So not to mention when you are cranking with 12 and you nick one rock, all of a sudden that is 8-pound or 9-pound test. And in that fork tournament, you were catching 8s, 9s like often. Yeah. So yeah, that's scary.
So I've got a question about selecting the right crankbait. And I think it's a question or it's something that not a lot of people take into consideration. But I'm hoping that you've got a great insight on it, Garrett. Does the angle of the bill make a difference as far as, so if you pick up that 8XD, the bill comes straight out of the face. But if you look at like a Norman DD22, the bill just kind of scoops down. Does that make a difference in the action? And do you utilize... If it does, do you utilize those two different actions for different styles of deep cranking?
Yeah, that's a good question. It does make a difference with the dive angle. So, when you got a bait that's straighter, it kind of tips the bait down, if that makes sense. Tips it down. Whereas when your bait is naturally, I'm trying to think, even that, it's still pretty straight. But when your bill comes down, it almost keeps your bait. The bill's already tipped, so your bait's a little flatter. That's almost more of like an old school probably mentality. Like I never grew up with the Normans and stuff like that. But I personally, I like that straighter bill coming off. I think, you get a more aggressive action with this. You get better deflection. You're down to your depth faster.
Yeah, it goes.
So I personally, I don't throw that. Yeah, I don't throw that angled bill a whole lot. For my deep cranks, of course, your square bills and stuff like that are all angled, but I like that flatter, straighter bill personally. There's probably some guys that, have different opinions on that, but from what I've seen for cranking the bait fast, for hitting, for getting down fast, I like that. If I can get that straighter bill, and there's a difference too of like where, almost as important is where your line tie comes off. If you put the line tie up here, the bait will hardly dive. Where if you put it back here, you'll get, the most depth. So that's another thing to look for is the bill angle and also the line tie. But I seem to prefer those, those straighter bills. And maybe that's not one that I've really thought about a whole lot. It just, when I look through my tackle box and over the years of experimenting and throwing some out, throwing some in the box, it seems like that straighter bill is, what works for my system. Predominant.
I think the thing too is that you look at a lot of the newer baits, not many of them has the newer baits, like recent, a lot of them maybe are more straight out of the bill. And I think that, like Garrett says, it's almost like they just get down there quicker, which is really, really important. And like you said, when you're making a long cast, I want to reiterate that too, because like a lot of times, for example, if you're fishing in 18, 19 foot of water, you have a crankbait that dives 20 foot, it's not going to hit that 20 foot in the first 15, 10% of the cast. You got to get that bait way past your sub or your target, and it'll creep its way down there. And that's why it's so important to have those long casts and to have a bait that's going to get down there as quick as possible. So I'm very curious to know about your hooks on a bait, because I know that I'm big into basically changing out all my treble hooks. So what treble hooks if any, do you keep stock on there, or do you replace them? I'm guessing you replace them, and if you do, what do you use? Do you like the EWG versus the round bend, anything like that?
Yeah, good question. I replace all my hooks. This is one. The Outsider comes with nano finesse hooks. Like, those are pretty sticky sharp. That's one you probably don't have to change. But when I started fishing, I threw a lot of EWGs, and I felt like when the fish is eating the bait really well, the EWG is the best hook. When the bait's in their mouth, you'll hardly lose them. But it just seems like nowadays that's not the case. So for me, it's pretty much all around bend. I have two that I essentially always throw. I got one. They're both Gamakatsus. This is a Magic Eye. This is a 2X gauge hook. So it's a short shank. So it's a short shank. So I'm able to get bigger trebles on there than our that comes stock, and it's got a big gauge, and that is a exceptional hook when you're dealing with big fish, like 4+ pound fish, I'd say. So you're thinking Texas, the TVA, Florida, stuff like that. The big gauge is good because once that hook gets into their mouth, it has a bigger barb, you'll hardly lose them. But on the flip side, with a bigger gauge or a thicker gauge hook, is sometimes it's harder to penetrate that hook, right? You gotta almost have more weight on the fish side to get that hook in. So when I'm dealing with situations with a smaller fish, I'm just throwing, this is just a standard Gamakatsu treble, nothing fancy. It's got a little bit of a longer shank. Let me see, that can kind of compare. You can almost see this is the this is the thicker round bend gauge. This is the thinner one. It's almost situational. So in most situations, I'm throwing the round bend. This is thinner. The hooks, penetrate easier. But if I feel like I'm in a situation with those really big fish, I'll go to that thicker gauge because I feel like the hook will penetrate easier. And then, of course, when you're with big fish, you don't want to bend out or anything, and that thicker gauge, kind of holds up to that. But yeah, Gamakatsu round bend for most situations. Big fish, Gamakatsu 2X Magic Eye are my two hooks. And then if there was a situation where I'm throwing it and, like, let's say every fish just has the crankbait choked in their mouth, that's a situation where I might switch to an EWG because I know that those fish are going to get locked up and never come off. But at that point with the round bends, you're probably getting them anyways. But yeah, I'm pretty much all a round bend guy now.
That's interesting. What is the significance of the Gamakatsu Magic Eye? I don't know if I've ever heard of that. Yeah,
the Magic Eye is just I don't know if you can see it. It's pointed on the top here. Okay. You can kind of see a little point, and that just makes it easier to actually just break it open your split ring. So it just makes changing them easier. That's what the Magic Eye means.
Oh, okay.
You can kind of see that. Yep. So the hook itself is, nothing with the hook. It's more of the top where
Gotcha.
For changing, make changing split rings real easy. And yeah, the sizes are, for the Magic Eyes, I'm usually using a 1/0 on the bigger crankbaits, like your 20-foot size crankbait, and then on my typical round bend, I'm going down to a size number 1, just because this has a longer shank. The biggest thing is you of course don't want these hooks to tangle, and then you get down into your 15-foot crankbaits, 5XD stuff, Fat Papa, DT14s, size number 2. But general good rule of thumb is you can go, if you can upsize one size of the standard treble or the stock treble, that's a pretty good rule of thumb. But you don't want to go so big and so heavy that you hurt the action of the bait. So, but I'll always upsize the size if I can fit it on the bait.
I think that's smart. I had a just my last question really about deep cranks is, if you had 3 color choices that you could use for anywhere you go, all over the place, what are those going to be?
Yeah, that's perfect. 'Cause I got them here. Number 1 would be something natural, green gizzard. I don't care if it's blue on the top, just something that's, a little bit of translucent, looks like a bait fish. And then I'd have a citrus shad, or this is called mellow yellow. I'd have a color like that. And then I'd have a chartreuse and blue for stained water or really deep water. But those are pretty much the only 3 I throw. And if I'm in a situation where I'm going to be doing this, I'm certainly going to have the same, or I'm going to certainly have the same crankbait on with, each different color. Like we talked about how you can switch to a silent crankbait and continue to get a few more bites. I've seen a lot of times where if I'm throwing a natural bait and I go to the chartreuse or I go to a white or the citrus, I'm able to get more bites too. So I'm definitely going to have the same bait in multiple colors if I'm going to be out cranking that day.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's the big thing that can hold up people, is just like overcomplicating color. And like those 3 are literally the same 3 that I would have. Some sort of shad or citrus type pattern, your real natural color, almost transparent, especially if you're dealing with smallmouth, which we didn't really talk about smallmouth a whole lot, but I think that you can do really well with them. They also like a chartreuse though too. And fish, but that chartreuse and blue is the one that I know I haven't used as much. But anyone who's really big into deep cranking, they are all like, you got to have a chartreuse and blue, which sometimes it doesn't make sense, because you'll see them cranking at, like the table rocks of the world and these really clear bodies of water with a chartreuse and blue, where you think, that might be too much. But again, you're fishing in deep water. The clarity is already going to be down, down from what it is. And so that's just a color that I need to buy more of.
I think like the chartreuse and blue too is more of a contrast. That when, if it's 20 feet deep, it might not actually look chartreuse and blue, but it's got a really interesting contrast to it.
Yeah.
I think that has to do with the different shades of chartreuse. It looked like that outsider crankbait was more of like a faded chartreuse. So I think that has more to do with it probably than the actual color of it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think they see colors, or bass in general see colors way different than we do. Like I know, if you ever watch Keith Combs fish, it's almost exclusively a chartreuse and blue if he's deep cranking. So, and to me, that's not natural. There's no bait fish in the world that I know of that looks like a chartreuse and blue. But when it gets down there 15 plus feet, maybe the chartreuse disappears to the fish, or it turns white or whatever. But whatever it is, it seems to look natural enough to them where they're able to bite. Or maybe it's just so bright and loud that it triggers the bite that way. I don't know, but that's one that when you look at it, you're like, this doesn't make sense, but it's caught too many fish to not throw it.
I think stick with the kind of the shad bait fish patterns. So I think when the fish get out in that deeper water, that's mostly what they're feeding on is bait fish, whether it could be bluegill, perch, shad. But I think the deeper they go, probably the less they focus on, crawfish. So, bait fish patterns, keep it simple. 3 patterns. Let's go.
Well, what a fun episode that was. If you guys have missed any of the Bass Juice podcasts, I'm going to leave a link right here for the playlist so that you can check out all of our episodes. Thanks for watching. Subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.